With me on Brief Encounters today is Lord Clement-Jones, former chair of the House of Lords AI Select Committee, a lawyer and a parliamentarian. Welcome to Brief Encounters, Tim.
Hi, Richard. Good to be with you.
Tim, you've done some amazing things throughout your career, but if we might, can we start right at the beginning? So how did you start your career when you graduated, and how did that bring you to what you're doing today?
Well, careers are often a matter of chance, and mine's no exception. And what happened was when I left university and I'd done, a couple of years law, you go, as you do, into a city law firm thinking you're going to become a hotshot commercial lawyer, all that kind of thing. And I was lucky enough to come across some partners and assistants there who were working at what was then the very first neighbourhood law centre in North Kensington, which Peter Candler had founded in 1970. And this was quite a radical idea that there should be a public law office, if you like, and that was replicated, eventually across London, across the regions and so on. But this was the very first one. And I went down there and, as a middle class individual, my father had gone to the same university, grandfather, all this kind of thing. And it was a real eye-opener because North Kensington was the inheritor of bad practices from the Rackman era, and housing evictions were a very big deal. All kinds of welfare issues, rights to social security, criminal issues, people being charged with offences. And, this was something that I really took away from that. And it changed my politics, actually. Ralph Darendorf, in more or less the same year, delivered his lectures, his Reith lectures on life chances. And so, which are basically the right to social opportunity and so on. And that just changed my politics. I've been a pretty conservative person up to that point. But then I joined the Liberals. Jeremy Thorpe nowadays has a bad name, but I, was lucky enough, in a sense, to be carried on a wave for a period. And I, stuck with them ever since. And so as a result, I've had a parallel career, and I've been extremely lucky in that respect. I was an in-house lawyer in some very big businesses for 25 years. But I've also been heavily involved in politics in the Liberals and now the Liberal Democrats, because I helped actually merge the Liberals with the Social Democrats back in the day. And, that's given me the ability to not only professionally do various interesting things, but also politically adapt to the changing environment. And of course, that's where AI comes in.
And we'll talk lots about AI, which has obviously become a very, very hot topic. But I was looking back in your career, and you were certainly talking a lot about this, I think, in 2017-18 when you were chairing the committee, and I think probably before that as well. What got you interested in AI specifically as a topic and as a policy area to be interrogated?
I think it was really discovery within the digital economy. I mean, I was the creative industry spokesperson for my party between about 2004 and 2010. And then we had the coalition government, and we all sort of became backbenchers, basically, except for a few of us who became ministers. Basically, I saw the change in the creative industries. For instance, Napster, which basically was ripping off everybody's copyright, was a very innovative, kind of digital approach to the delivery of music. And you'll recall that Apple and people like that jumped onto that very quickly, but they made it legit. So I'm all, well, things are moving digital here. You can't stay analog for very much longer. So all the changes in the digital economy were things that I tracked. And in 2016, I was sitting down with the Industry and Parliament Trust, and we were talking about tech and the digital economy at a breakfast in the Commons. And I was actually sitting next door to Stephen Metcalfe, who at that time was the Science and Technology chair. And I said, Stephen, what's happening? We need to get to grips with what's happening with AI in particular, because it looks to me, certainly looking around the table, parliamentarians don't know nearly enough about this aspect of the digital economy. And so I co-founded with Stephen the all-party AI group. And then, as a result of having done that, it's in the kingdom of the blind, the one eyed man is king. I was asked to chair the select committee on AI, and various other things have followed. I proposed, select committees on lethal autonomous weapons, which is a form of AI. And, I've done, an awful lot with the OECD and the Council of Europe and so on as time has gone on. So, it's exactly what I started off by talking about. One thing has led to another. But of course, that's the great thing. We're very lucky sometimes that you can pursue your interests in this way. And then you find that actually the interest that you've pursued is a matter of public interest. AI has only increased in terms of public interest, especially after, GPT-4, Chat GPT arrived on the scene in whatever it was, November 22.
And it's been, I mean, for us as an AI software company founded actually at the same time you were chair of the House of Lords Committee on Artificial Intelligence. Back then it was a relatively niche topic. I mean, people were talking about it, but it was far from mainstream. And as you say, over the last couple of years, with the rise of GPT and generative AI and now agentic AI, it is shifting a bit into the mainstream. And one of the areas, speaking to you as a fellow lawyer, which obviously we've been very interested in, is how AI will be applied to services. And back in 2017-18, there was very little use of AI in, for example, professional services, and this is now changing. And what I wanted to ask you was that if you look at the UK GDP and you look at where our economy is made up, it is mostly services. I think the last stat I saw was about 80% of the UK economy is services. I'm just kind of curious how you see that development within the UK and whether will be particularly affected by the disruption to services, the improvement to services, however you want to think about what's going to happen as we apply AI to the professions and to services more generally.
Well, it's a huge issue. I mean, when we first started looking at all this, and certainly the Select Committee looked at quite a lot of aspects as to how it would impact on employment, we all thought, and let's take the legal profession as an example, we all thought, hey, this is going to do away with paralegals. We're not going to need those basic functions, admin functions dealt with anymore. AI is going to deal with all that. Well, actually, now we're looking at the exact reverse. We're looking at where a much more sophisticated AI than we ever envisaged back in 2016-17 is actually giving paralegals the ability to do what an experienced lawyer would now do. And of course, that brings all kinds of issues with it. First of all, as a major employer, and it doesn't have to be in the legal profession, it can be, right across the piece. As a major employer, what is your approach? Is it substitutional or is it augmentative? Are you basically helping your employees by adding technology to what they do, perform their jobs, or are you basically saying, in order to be more productive, basically we're going to say, right, AI will do all this, and we'll try and have the minimal amount of meaningful human intervention, for instance. So attitudinally, this has made a huge difference. And, I place a lot of emphasis, not just on regulation, because regulation, frankly, could be superseded by the European Act. And, there are other international actors which place, us in a rather different situation. But in terms of corporate governance, the values by which a company is governed become ever more important in the face of AI. And, people talk about ESG and all this kind of stuff. Well, of course, I'm a big fan of all that. But unless you get the values that underpin the business right, no amount of ESG washing is really going to do the trick. So, that's where I do spend quite a bit of time talking to boards about, the fact that AI is not just another piece of technology. People love talking about the neutrality of technology. We mustn't regulate for a particular form of AI or a particular technology. Well, in terms of corporate governance, we really do have to do that.
And what do you see in the field there? So, as you go and advise those boards, what's the kind of general level of education and understanding that you see there? And what are the kind of common challenges and pitfalls that you've seen in boards operating and just trying to figure out, does this mean for us as a company and what does this mean for the future?
Yes, I mean that's a great question because it does vary considerably. I mean, it's a bit like the House of Lords, quite frankly. You get some people who are very, very good at this stuff. They pick it up very quickly. They understand its relevance to business. But actually, the majority of people think, "Oh, the digital stuff. I'm not sure about that. Let's ask the CTO or the CIO to prepare a paper or something like that," without thinking that actually you need to set the tone. You need to have leadership right at that top level, and you can't shy away from the digital world. And we see this in things like online safety. Parents haven't understood this stuff historically. We're beginning to get to grips with this now, but we're always in a process of catch up. And I get the feeling, even in the big companies, there is a catch-up process still going on, and I don't think yet it's fully integrated. For instance, do audit and risk committees encompass, all the risks attendant on the adoption of AI and other new technologies, when they prepare their risk register and things of this sort. I'm not yet convinced that it's completely mainstream at the moment. And of course, if that's the situation in the big companies, and I've sat around a table with a lot of NEDs in my time, and some of them bring useful experience, but an awful lot don't. And then the smaller companies, of course, where they're not in the tech sector, are at even greater disadvantage. And of course, politicians talk about, oh, we must adopt, more new technology and get growth and productivity and stuff like that. But, they're held back by all kinds of factors. And there are a lot of surveys that demonstrate that, fear of cost, lack of understanding about what the technology can deliver, all of that stuff, is holding people back from adoption, basically.
And certainly we spend a lot of time, working with large corporates and in-house legal teams. We see something similar. But maybe to take you back, though, to North Kensington, in this industry with AI and the law, we often are thinking about large business and we're thinking about law firms and what can be the advantages. But actually thinking about more like access to justice and thinking about the other end of that profession, where do you see the potential for AI to help? Are we going to get better access to justice, for example?
Yeah, absolutely right. We need investment in those sort of areas because, you need the admin backup. You need, just basic things, reminders. You need, access to housing answers and things of this sort, and not and tailored to the individual. It's all very well to have FAQs, but, we want to go much beyond the ordinary FAQ by using artificial intelligence. I use search engines all the time powered by AI. I'm a big fan of those, especially those that actually have references, appended to their answers, and things like that where clearly it's not hallucination, it's real, they're proper answers. I think is increasingly the nature of the game. So this is what we're going to be able to do. We're going to be able to feed in questions when a client in a law center comes in, and that's going to really be helpful. But of course, then you have to understand that actually how you deal with the client, you have to have proper human intervention. You have to have a level of understanding about the circumstances in which they operate. And you have to have some fire in your belly too, quite honestly. And, although AI is splendid in many respects, the one thing it doesn't have is fire in its belly and empathy.
It's so interesting that question on kind of what do people do and what will AI do? And there is quite a lot of talk at the moment in the legal profession about decision making by AI. And so over the last couple of years, The judiciary, for example, has said, well, it might be possible to get a kind of first draft of a judgment, for example, drafted by AI. But of course, the trained lawyers and the judges will kind of verify word by word, and in fact, all judgments will be human level. And that may be the case in, the High Court. But in cases of small disputes or in cases of fully autonomous decision making, there's huge benefit, but there are also huge risks. And just curious how you think about things like discrimination and bias and misinformation in the context of more vulnerable people actually accessing that autonomous decision making to get a result which may or may not be accurate.
Well, that's bang up my street, because one of the things I'm most concerned about is the use of AI in public services. And by public services, of course, I'd include the justice system, the welfare system, decisions by the Home Office, etc., etc. And I've got a private members bill, which I've putting forward this year. We're having a debate on it at the beginning of mid-December. This is really important, that the framework within which you use AI and you make automated decisions or decisions with minimal human involvement basically fall within, a set of principles, that you have the right of redress, that there's a transparency, for instance, there's a register of the AI models used and so on, so that, this is not a black box as far as the public are concerned. Otherwise, people lose faith in this new technology. And if we're going to actually, in my view, make life more effectively governed, we need to adopt the technology. So I'm keen that we don't have this abreaction and that we do keep public trust. It's really important, therefore, that we actually have this framework that is fully understood in the public sector. And in a sense, you could argue the public sector needs to set the example. And, at the moment, I don't see any proposals apart from some algorithmic transparency recording standard, which, isn't yet right across government. But that's what's proposed. But for me, that isn't fundamental enough. And, obviously, we'll be having that debate as time goes on, not only when I put my private members bill forward, but also when the government bring forward what I think is going to be a bit of a mouse in terms of an AI bill, which will purely deal with the developers of the large language models, the so-called frontier AI developers.
And it's so interesting how the debate always goes to efficiency in government. So, just at the last budget, you're seeing kind of 2% efficiency targets across departments. And everyone says, well, if you use technology for more efficiency, and may or may not be the case, but actually what's changing is the service delivery, the means through which you are actually delivering a service, the decision making on an asylum application or whatever it may be fundamentally different. And actually it's the difference in the service delivery where the risk comes in. And it's very tempting to say, well, we're going to save money. Okay. But actually what is the trade-off, and what are you getting in
Absolutely. And you're back to values, and of course, if you have every civil society organization up in arms about the way that you're running particular government departments or decisions being made, or, whatever it may be, that is not a very productive way of doing things. So you've got to take people with you. And, the trouble is, where people madly are either gross pessimists about the adoption of this kind of technology, or they're gross optimists. I mean, I've always looked for, and I think our select committee, pretty much hit the right mark. We found a balance between the two. But of course, the narrative historically has been very, very polarized. So, you've got Elon Musk saying it's the worst thing since nuclear weapons. You had the late Stephen Hawking say it was either the best or worst thing for humanity. And then you've got the tech bros who basically want to move fast and break things, and everything's absolutely fine, guys, voluntary agreements, well, fine, but we don't want any other form of regulation because it hurts innovation, So you get this very polarized narrative, and, trying to steer a course, even with a new government that comes in all bright and bushy-tailed and thinks that, with a new duty on DCIT to get AI adopted right across the piece in government. That kind of over enthusiasm worries me. You have to be quite careful about the risks involved in all of this, as well as the opportunities.
Let's talk a bit about regulation. You mentioned regulation coming in and potentially missing the mark. We've obviously seen the EU AI Act. I suspect we'll see something happening in the Trump administration along a different vector. What do you think are we missing the mark here, and why is focusing on those kind of underlying large language models actually not really doing what we need regulation to do?
Yeah, it's a bit sad, really, because we were ahead of the game. I mean, when Theresa May was prime minister, and how many people look back and say Theresa May was doing the right thing? But she was actually. She made a speech in Davos in, I think, early 2018, just before we published our report. Previous to that, we'd had the Hall Percenti review. Dame Wendy Hall, and Jerome Percenti produced what I thought was a really good report. It didn't deal with the ethics of AI, but it did deal with the institutions that would be required, in a sense, to develop it. And it was quite carefully done, talking about the Center for Data Ethics and Innovation, talking about a council for AI of industry leaders, and talked about an office for AI in government. And that was really a good framework. And then they set up the Alan Turing Institute as basically the fount of wisdom on tech, the details of the technology. But then that was eroded over a period of time. We all expected much, much quicker action in terms of translating ethics into hard regulation of some kind. And effectively, we've been overtaken by the EU. And I think the Brussels effect, as happened with the GDPR, for instance, on data, that is basically going to take place, in terms of AI. But there are ways through that. Whatever this government does probably won't really stand up to the kinds of requirements of some of our major international companies. They will adhere to the AI Act in the EU because, they're international. They have to find a highest common denominator, put it that way, across the board. Otherwise, they'll get penalized fairly heavily in the EU. That's why, I preach the gospel of international standards, because whatever the mandation of particular regulations, standards, if you have them internationally set, you can then have interoperability, and both your developers and adopters get the certainty and consistency that they need across the board. So, that is pretty important, really. And the EU, I know, going forward, is very keen on making sure that the international standards, or rather the standards they are adopting for the purposes of the AI Act, actually are international in their nature. They're not trying to reinvent the wheel. So, for instance, risk assessment, very close to what NIST in the States has been doing, various other standards that are being put down and saying will be part of a conformity assessment, actually are those that International Standards Organization is putting forward, or the IEEE, and so on and so forth. So I'm actually quite optimistic that whatever this government do on regulation, the question of adoption of international standards will proceed, I think, quite well. It's just a question of time. I just regret the fact that we couldn't have played a leading role. Bletchley, for instance, I think was a complete red herring. Just talking about large language models is not good enough. And funny enough, it's the one flaw, I think, in the EU's AI Act. It separates out large language models from other forms of AI. Well, frankly, they should adhere to the same principles, the same risk assessment, and so on. This idea that, frontier AI is something very special. They're all machine learning, basically, as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, and always, the technology moves faster than the regulation. So, but it's interesting for us. I mean, we're really the application layer, so we're not building large language models. We are like most software companies, which is drawing from the LLMs and building on top. And obviously, software is now just by its nature international. And half our clients are in the US and half are in the EU, and so this is often, I think, missed. Do you worry? I mean, we obviously have a new administration coming in the US. There's a lot of talk about protectionism. Do you worry that this could erode international cooperation and standards where actually across the Atlantic and around the world, we can actually get to a more unified set of regulation.
I am quite worried actually, because one of the interesting things was that the people in charge of AI policy under Trump in his last administration and Biden were exactly the same. It was one of the changes that normally happens that didn't happen between the two administrations. However, it seems to me that this time Trump has really got the bit between his teeth in terms of deregulation. And I worry that people like NIST, the National Institute for Standards and Technology in the States, which has a huge reputation, he's already, said, I don't like, them. He regards them as being regulators, and he thinks they're holding back innovation and so on. Now, we never know with Trump whether or not he'll do a 360 or something, or is it a 180, whichever it is. He will completely alter course. But it does worry me that if we take him at his word, that some of that US move towards at least helping with international standards may change. And as it is, and of course the DOJ and its approach to competition policy, antitrust policy, has been very useful. It's been an ally with Europe, looking at Apple and Google and so on and so forth. Well, I think Trump may very well, continue with a vendetta against the DOJ for all kinds of historical reasons, And again, that's not going to help, because I don't want to see this over concentration of power within big tech. I mean, the Competition and Markets Authority here in the UK has done some really useful work looking at the shareholding links, the partnerships, commercial partnerships between big tech and people like OpenAI and Anthropic and so on and so forth. Well, that's very useful, and we don't see yet the market power quite yet. Although let's face it, reputationally, who, when they talk about large language models, doesn't use the word GPT? Basically, it's a bit like googling something. We're going to have GPT search, which will probably dominate the the AI search space. So we have to be very wary that we're not, at the end of the day, faced with a choice between Coke and Pepsi, basically, in the digital world. We've seen that so many times before, Microsoft MS versus OS. We see it on app platforms. We see it in cloud services. And I worry that actually this is going to happen in the AI area. Luckily, AI has many, many different applications. And as you say, there are many layers on these sort of stacks. And, everybody's going to be finding their niche on that. But ultimately, the big power is those who've got these semiconductors, who've got the exacompute, compute, who've got the skills, who've got the massive amounts of data, which, in many ways they've scraped in breach of copyright and data protection from the web. So, we've got to be pretty wary of that.
And that concentration of power, I mean, obviously goes beyond AI, but we have if you were to look at the top 10 companies by market cap now versus when you were starting out in your career, it's a very different picture, and you have massive concentrations of capital and power, which is now obviously playing out in AI. So you have to have the affordability to go and get the compute from NVIDIA, and you can probably only afford it if you are Meta or Alphabet or Microsoft. Maybe off the topic of AI, has there just been a failure of competition regulation here? I mean, how have we allowed ourselves to get into a position of tech monopolies over this stuff?
We're always playing catch up in this space. I mean, look, we understood to quite an extent what was happening, in terms of social media. But how long did it take us to legislate the Online Safety Act? It took at least 5 years, if not 6. Same in Europe, in the States, they don't really have very much at all. And then the same is true of competition policy. I mean, Jason Furman, I think, did a report back in 2016 that had been commissioned by George Osborne in the Treasury, and it's taken us 8 years to get that. I don't think the Digital Markets Act is actually on the statute book. It is on the statute book, but it's not in force quite yet. The codes of conduct are still being developed by the Competition and Markets Authority. So, this ex ante a type of regulation which looks at the behavior of these major tech companies as it may develop. And this is the beauty of it, that at least you can try and anticipate what may happen in the future in terms of concentration. We're not even there yet, and it's only just come into effect effectively in Europe, one of the big issues is everybody builds these walled gardens around their particular tech. So Apple and Samsung and so on and Google, effectively you cannot transfer from one to another. And the same is true of cloud services. And, and this is what worries me, is that we're going to find these walled gardens in AI as well.
Very interesting. And the regulation question across borders, I think, we see this a little in the weeds day to day, but the premise of deregulation in one country as being of net benefits to the companies in that country is a questionable assumption, right? So if you are OpenAI and you get a better regulatory regime in the US, to a certain extent, it doesn't matter so much in the delivery of services because you're already a global business. I mean, you're operating in the EU, you have to comply with the highest barrier of regulation anyway. So it'd be very interesting to see how that, if this turns into, whatever people predict, a trade war or whatever, or regulatory competition, actually, whether it will yield any benefit on a net basis to people in the US or elsewhere.
Yeah, there are already games being played, though, basically people saying, we can't deliver the latest technology to the EU consumer because you've got all this regulation and stuff like that. I mean, I think a lot of that is games playing. And I think you're right. Eventually, they will have to, adhere to that highest common denominator. And let's not forget that the EU AI Act is extraterritorial. So what they're saying is, unless you've conformed to our AI Act, we're not going to allow your product to be exploited. I think that unless people don't want a market of 450 million consumers, then it's going to be quite difficult, really.
Economics at the end of the day, right?
Exactly.
We've talked, Tim, on some really interesting topics, and we've talked a lot about the risks involved in AI. Just to end on a more positive note, what excites you about the developments that you're seeing in AI in particular, and what benefits can this yield for society?
Well, the area that we singled out back in 2018 was healthcare, and that's still a big deal. It isn't just about treatment. I mean, of course, we all know about the imaging and things of that sort, which are fantastic in terms of diagnosis, of cancer and other conditions and so on, and analyzing blood tests and all that sort of area. But preventative healthcare, where you are aligning genomics with AI, for instance, I think could be a fantastic thing. And there are some interesting things happening. There's Future Health, which Sir John Bell is very keen on. There are things that are happening. Tim Spector at King's, there are a number of very senior academic clinicians, if you like, who are heavily involved in harnessing the power of AI in healthcare. And I think that preventative healthcare aspect at the end of the day is going to be, one of the things that's going to help us lead not only longer, but also healthier lives in that respect. Even if you then look in other sectors like education, if we get it right and we make sure that, we're not abusing data rights and things like that, we can get personalized education up and running. And already that's beginning to show fruits in certain private schools which have adopted it. I want to see this more publicly available, but we've got to take advantage of it, and we have to have models that are commercially available at reasonable cost in the public sector. and so on. And we're back again to making sure that we've got the governance framework in the public sector on foot as well. But no, I'm a tech optimist, and that's why I believe in regulation. Because if you're a tech optimist, you believe in harnessing the power of AI, for instance. But in order to do so, you have to have public trust, and to have public trust, you have to have that regulatory and standards framework.
Lord Clement-Jones, thank you so much for being on Brief Encounters. When does your private members bill come out?
Comes out, I think the debate is on the 13th of December. It's actually in print now. People go on the parliamentary website and then they can see what we're on about, basically. And it's called something like the Public Authority, Algorithmic and Automated Decision Making Bill, if people have the appetite for it.
Certainly I do, and I will check it out. But thank you so much for being on Brief Encounters again.
Huge pleasure, Richard. Thanks for asking me.